welcome everybody. I'm here with Dr. Vaughan today. And as you know, I've been wanting to have him on my channel for a while because he is a sociologist of religion, talks a lot about the effects religion can have on society and people. He's done a lot of work in this area. He's got a lot of research published on there. So Dr. Vaughan, how you doing? Welcome to the channel.
Good, man. Good to meet with you in person again or on camera again. And yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so this is your first time here on person, but you've done a lot of work behind the scenes helping the channel grow and helping me with videos. If people are not aware, that's what I've been consulting you on for probably about a year now.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know, I'll put this up here so people can see. So of these videos here, Dr. Vaughan has helped with 3 of them. Does Christianity cause war and violence? Does Christianity cause nationalism? And is Christianity harmful? And he has given me a lot of studies on this. He reviewed them before they were public. He has been a huge help in making these videos that I've been trying to put out. He also recently helped with this video that just came out where we addressed the meager moral fruits argument. It was a philosophical argument that some atheists have put out, arguing that the moral fruits of Christians is really low, and this is evidence against Christianity. It's not a knockdown argument, but it's evidence against it. And so we addressed that argument in this video quite extensively. So if you want to see some of the stuff that Dr. Vaughan has been helping me with, these are the videos to go to. Other than Is Christianity Anti-Science? I think I published that one before we started talking, but you've helped with a lot of the work here, which I do really appreciate. Yeah. So tell us about yourself and your credentials.
Sure. So I am a sociologist of religion, as you mentioned. I also would identify as a political sociologist. I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I went away and I worked for a while. I worked overseas. I came back to the U.S. and kind of got the fire lit under me to do scholarship again. Or to do scholarship, I guess, for the first time. And I got a terminal master's degree at the same university, the University of Texas at San Antonio. I had some really good mentors there who kind of took an interest in wanting me to go get my PhD and pursue this as a scholarly endeavor. So they sent me over to Baylor University, where I got a doctorate, formally labeled, in the sociology of religion. I then went up to Connecticut, where I was an in-residence faculty member for 3 years. Assistant professor in residence was my title at the University of Connecticut, a public R1 university up north. And I've since taken a tenure-track job a lot closer to home down here in central Oklahoma. I do a lot of research on religion, politics. I do particularly focus on democratic backsliding, attitudes toward immigration. I do some work in the sociology of race and ethnicity as well. Kind of study a lot of normal topics, inequality and public health and things like that. So got a wide array of interests with kind of a central theme.
Right. And you've done some excellent work. I've read a couple of those papers that you specifically published that I have used in some of my videos as well, and they're excellent. So the reason I brought you on my channel today, as you know, but for the audience's sake, is because online people like myself often encounter anti-theists or militant atheists that attack religion as harmful. It's holding society back. It's not going to lead us into a better world, and we need to throw off the shackles of religion to advance into a new society. So we see this rhetoric a lot, and it seems to be what a lot of the online atheist apologists, as I would call them, seems to be what puts the wind in their sails. They're making these videos trying to deconvert people. Not all of the atheists online, but a good portion of them. They're making these videos because they actively see religion as harmful, and they want to deconvert people to bring us into a more enlightened era. So that's why I wanted to bring you on. As I said, you've helped with a lot of the videos I've already put out, but I wanted people to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. I wanted people to hear it from you, who's the direct professional on a lot of this data that I've been using in the past. So that's why I brought you on. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So Dr. Vaughan, my first question for you is anti-theists like Graham Oppie, for example, Gregory Paul, Phil Zuckerman. They often use data that shows countries with lower levels of religiosity or church attendance have higher levels of crime, illicit drug use, premarital sex, this kinds of thing. Is this data useful, and what can it tell us?
Okay, yeah. So I would, where to start here? So it's useful for sure, but what it can tell us, I think, kind of goes in different directions here. And I think different scholars have kind of handled this a bit differently. And so I like a lot of Zuckerman's published work, as we were talking about before this started. I think Oppie I fully acknowledge he's like one of the best in the philosophy of religion in this area, but
Absolutely.
I think some of the social science he cited, maybe we'll get into that later, is a bit off. I think Paul's work as well. He's not a sociologist, right? And I'm not much of a gatekeeper. I believe in autodidacts, and I think people can do really great work. But the one kind of popular study from him, I think it's a lot wrong as well. So, I mean, what can this tell us? I'll start with Zuckerman, because I think his is kind of the best, and he's been a bit more careful, at least earlier on, right? Like, so he found, that like he'll have a limited number of countries, which is normal. You have the data that you have, and you can't control what people have prepared for you. So no one's accusing him of like cherry picking or anything like that, right? Like you got to marry a data set that has the perfect intersection or the best possible intersection of the variables that you want. And yeah, for sure. By some measures of secularization, you will find that some of the more secularized countries in the West do have lower rates of crime, do have higher rates of happiness by some measures. This is a problem, right? Where it's like, and again, what Zuckerman is doing is fine, but by the time it hits the public, people don't recognize that we have different data sets. We have different ways of measuring happiness. We have like a lot of ways of looking at this. And so, in every public presentation I've seen from Zuckerman, he'll say, listen, I think there might be something to this. I do want to point out that just because something is true about the nation doesn't mean it's true about the individuals, and that relationship doesn't cover over. So you have this problem of the ecological fallacy, which I don't think Zuckerman commits, but like a lot of people who get excited about his work do. They're like, oh, well, if the nation is secular and it's really happy, then that tells us that it's secular people who are becoming really happy because of this. Or if it's low religiosity and low crime, these two things must be true about the individuals. Well, that could be true, right? But we have ways for sort of sorting these things out. It's also true that the hottest, the areas with the highest ice cream sales also have the highest rates of murder too, right? Like that correlation doesn't really give us a causal mechanism, though. And then you introduce a third factor, and you realize heat, right? Summer ice cream sales is popular when it's hot, and crime goes up in the summer as well. So they can tell us that these areas are low crime, but if you were to go into the broader literature in criminology, I mean, there is some debate, right? Like, I don't want to oversell this and say like all scholars agree that religiosity is like a silver bullet to crime or anything, but I mean, you do have some good research out there. You have, someone I work with a lot, who is not a religious person herself. Like, it's kind of the tack that the approach that she takes to see religion as kind of buffering against crime in society. Like, there's good meta-analytic research here as well. That like when the studies are combined, we do see that there is a probably modest effect of religion working to prevent crime. So, like, what's happening then, right? Well, there are other things that are true about these nations as well. I mean, these nations tend to be wealthier than some of the other nations as well. And basic strain theory will tell us that that will tell us that crime is more common in areas that are impacted by negative economic conditions, as people run out of like viable, normatively accepted resources for feeding themselves, getting the goal, accomplishing normative goals. That the term is innovation, right? Like they'll seek alternative routes to doing this. It's true that these nations have a particular set of policies, and if I were to go into the literature, I think that's where the greatest evidence is. That I think these nations have a pretty. I mean, none are perfect, and I could poke holes in all of them, but I think these nations do have kind of solid ways of addressing crime. I think their kind of rehabilitative justice systems are maybe better than what we're used to here. It's my personal assessment. But within these countries, you find at the individual level that for individuals who attend religious services, whether it's Christian or otherwise, they are less likely to engage, at least in some forms of crime. I'm not aware of any cases where they're more likely to. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not commonly reported. And that in these countries, because a very common one too, like they'll say high crime or low crime and also high happiness, right? Well, in every one of these nations, I mean, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, China as well, like we have research. I work in the area of China. We have research that associates religiosity with happiness in these nations, right? Which kind of works against that interpretation.
Just to add some clarification here, in these countries you mentioned, these are the countries that people like Phil Zuckerman cite that have low religiosity but good benefits. And so some atheists grab his work and go, see, secularism leads to better societies.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about when we bring up nations like Denmark or China.
Sure. Yeah. That they're very highly secularized by some signs, right? Like in terms of like church attendance, definitely it's like plummeted in these nations. And in terms of like who identifies with Christianity, the previous or the outgoing majority religion, that's definitely been on the decline and continues to be so. To do so, they do. Some of these nations still will have like state churches, right? So like I think somebody would not want me to look at these nations and be like, see what's going on here. They've got state churches and the United States doesn't, right? We need to establish a Christian church as ruling the government. There are a lot of things that are true about these countries. And I'm not saying that the state churches do it. I don't think it does. And I wouldn't want that in the US, right? But like there are lots of things that are true about these nations. Likewise, I don't think it's the weather that's in these very cold countries as well that's leading to it. So you have to look for mechanisms. Mechanisms matter. We don't have strong evidence of secularization erasing crime. We don't have strong evidence of secularization erasing some supposed harm that religion was causing on our minds. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that secular people are then predisposed to committing crimes, right? I'm not saying that they are predisposed to nihilism, which is a really ugly stereotype that's out there. But the evidence of harm is not there. And there are counter evidences of religion serving public goods. Secular people who are not religious, they have different routes apart from religion to conforming to basically basic norms and to being happy, right? Like I'm not trying to pick one or the other, but yeah, I think hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. So basically, to just summarize, what we're seeing is when you look into these nations that may be more secular, we got to take in multiple factors that are playing into this. It's not just low religion, positive benefits, coincidence. That's not how this sort of works. And as you noted, there's not a lot of good evidence secularism erases a lot of these negative effects. It just seems to be a correlative thing that happens. Like you see, if people are more educated, secularism just sometimes happens among people with more master's degrees, for example. And people with master's degrees also tend to live in areas that have less crime because they can afford it. So that's an issue that people need to think about when this.
Right. There are lots of things that are true about these places and these people. They're not only religious, secular people and people who commit less crime. Yeah.
So atheists will often use this data online to say like this shows religion leads to more negative qualities. If why would the U.S. Have such poor negative results, especially in the Bible Belt, if religion was not somehow causing this? Whereas you go to like Sweden or Denmark, they have low religion, they have a much better, they have lower crime, they have lower drug use, lower issues with poverty. So what would you say to atheists to sort of keep using this data to try to argue that religion leads to these negative qualities? Sure.
I mean, I've heard this like even in religious settings, right? Like so. When I was younger and first exploring faith for myself, I'm an adult convert to Christianity. Like I was a part of a church that was like really kind of into kind of undoing the damage that like to our reputation, right? And so like I hear this like in a lot of places, and for sure it's not like religious people are flawless, right? Like there are religiously linked social problems. But I look at like the American South, for example. We call it the Bible Belt, where I live right now. And again, there are a lot of things that are true about the American South. The American South. Has never fully recovered from devastating, civil war that I fully admit we brought on ourselves. That's a part of our history, right? We're also generally the poorest part of the country as well. And poverty is a very strong predictor of a host of social outcomes. So be controversial for some, so send the messages to me. I think we have bad leaders in much of the American South, and I don't agree with the policies here. And I think the evidence is clear there. Of course, I'm not imputing that onto you. You can tweet me if you don't like that. But I think there are a lot of things that are true about the American South besides our religious identity, right? And so, again, when I look at certain deleterious outcomes here, healthcare, right? Or sorry, not health, poor health in the American South. I know that there's some speculation on religion there. I mean, religion does have a lot of positive effects here. But I mean, I think generally speaking, that poorer areas tend to also be food deserts, right? And there's like a lot of liquor stores, there's a lot of Taco Bells, there's a lot of McDonald's, there's not a lot of grocery stores, there's not a lot of Whole Foods, right? Like there are a ton of things that are true about the U.S. South besides us being highly religious compared to the rest of the country.
Yeah, good point. Getting into that, and just so people are aware, we're talking mostly about Christian religiosity. It's hard to talk about a lot of these other religions when a lot of it centers studies in like America and Europe where Christianity is dominant. And a lot of the other religions, especially religions like Buddhism or Hinduism and even Islam, have not been studied nearly to the extent that Christianity has been studied. So we're mostly talking about Christian religiosity. just people are aware. So with regards to that, these analysis of this countrywide data, looking at secular nations that are more secular versus countries that have more religion, is this useful in any way? Like you mentioned that Phil Zuckerman's work is useful in some ways. How is it useful for us?
Okay, I did lose you for a second. Do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, how is this data, this countrywide data, useful?
Do you mean like within a single country, or like comparing country to country?
And comparing countries to countries, like more religious to more secular.
Sure. I mean, like, I do want to know what's happening, right? Like, I do a lot of work in like international sociology, and so when I see that, Denmark et al. Or whatever are doing something, and there's higher rates of health, there's lower rates of crime. I don't want to live in a high crime neighborhood. I don't want me and my neighbors to be unhealthy, right? Like, I do want to know why, but I want to know what role religion possibly could play there. But I don't see, evidence of religion tearing things apart. I do see evidence of policy influencing things. I see really interesting comparative historical stories happening as well. Like, what are these countries' legacies with war and other outcomes like this, right? Like, it is definitely interesting, and I don't think that it's random. But what we'll typically do, especially like in quantitative sociology, then we'll set like aggregate rates of chronic disease or depression or something as our dependent variable, or per capita murders per year or something like that as our dependent variable. And we'll take a theoretically and empirically informed approach to saying, okay, what can we predict would lead to this here, right? And most of the time I'll find that I'll plug in religion and it'll either go in a kind of opposite expected direction per kind of that kind of pro-modernization, secularization thesis, or I'll find that something else is at play here. I tend to find that it's policy. I've worked with people in that area, and so then I'll take a step back then and I'll ask, well, okay, like, where does the policy come from, right? And there are, in the United States, we have like a really kind of simple story that's kind of echoed about how religion relates to policy. And if you take a trip around the world, I think it's a bit more diverse, right? So like, it's a step for sure. I'm not saying to throw that out. I would, with my own students, I probably wouldn't assign Paul or Oppie, but I would assign some of Dr. Zuckerman's work. I mean, I think it's good, fair quality work that exists in a broader body of literature. And I think probably, though, if you were to read his, he had a couple of books that were really helpful, and some of his peer-reviewed article work, and read the broader literature, you would place it maybe a bit differently than how that comes up in maybe like a Freedom of Religion Foundation speech, or kind of one of the charts that'll show up on Twitter saying, we'll see, religious people are less supportive of this policy outcome in this country at this snapshot in time. Therefore, that's like a whole aggregate measure of morality. So I think it's a piece of the puzzle.
So let's talk a little. You have a second. Talk a little bit about Graham Oppie. He's a brilliant philosopher, but when he steps into sociology, he seems to not know what he's talking about. But I've seen atheists on Twitter cite him and some of the things he said as if it's some really great stuff. What are some issues you see when he is doing this? When he responded to J.P. Moreland, for example.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's the Moreland article. I took more issue with than Atheism the Basics, but they both have problems. So J.P. Moreland made an argument. It's kind of an old kind of canard, and I do agree with Oppie for having problems with this. That kind of attributes does attribute atheism essentially to daddy issues, right? Like people don't believe in God because they had a bad physical father, so they don't want a bad earthly father, so they reject the entire notion of fatherhood, including a heavenly father. Maybe this sounded kind of interesting theoretically a century ago, but I mean there isn't good evidence to support that. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary. There's a lot of I won't trail off. There's good evidence to the contrary. And if I were Oppie, I just would have cited that and said no. He starts off with a kind of interesting tact that I don't fully object to at first, where he cites an older book by Pataki, which is kind of another version of the God delusion. And he says, listen, paraphrasing here, Oppie put it more elegantly than I would. But he says, listen, like this is not a pleasant thing to read, right? To read people like me and people I care about who are atheists being psychoanalyzed poorly as having daddy issues, right? That's kind of insulting. And so he brings up Pataki's book. And he's like, read this thesis and ask yourself how you feel reading that, because it's very negative. And would you like more nuance called? Would you like more accuracy brought to the table in describing you? And I think that is a fine exercise for him to ask for in response. He moves on to another argument where he says, here's what we know about religion and society. And based on that, what Moreland says is almost certainly false. And this is, and it's not so much that he's contradicting Moreland. I'm fine with that. I would do the same thing. But he states these things as kind of normatively true about religion, right? So he associates religion with crime, which is contradicted by a lot of literature out there. He associates religion with low intelligence. He does this by citing Richard Lynn and Helmuth Nyborg, who are kind of like notorious scientific racists. So like these people, they have published in kind of bad journals. Richard Lynn runs Mankind Quarterly, which is like, so Charles Murray in his book, The Bell Curve, I think he cited like 70% from that journal when he's talking about like race and IQ. And they have this really, there's a lot of methodological problems with it, and this is why psychologists reject it. But they have this idea that like race correlates with IQ, and they try to like rank it as like Asian and white versus all other minority groups. And it's a large N sample, so it's really easy to find significance where it doesn't exist. They don't control for anything. And if you're, I mean, education can affect your IQ, even like your economic conditions. Like there has been experimental research that shows IQ varies by like even being hungry or having slept enough. And anyway, it's like a bad study, right? So why am I talking about this? Because they replicate it and do the exact same thing with religion. And they kind of do that wrong too, actually. I so go in just, directions with this.
So just to summarize what you're saying and then jump back in, but what we have seen is when people like Graham Oppie or Gregory Paul, they look at countrywide data and they go look at the countries with low religion, they have better results. Well, some of these people you've mentioned that have put out these racist studies do the same thing with race. They'll go look at these areas with low IQ, look at all of the minorities there, look at these areas with more white people, look at how much higher the IQ is. Coincidence? So we're not accusing these people like Phil Zuckerman or Gregory Paul of being racist, but they're using a similar tactic in a lot of ways. They're basically saying like, look, we have found one correlate in this one area and look at, and then we've also seen, low religion or high religion. Well, racists could do the same thing. Look at the low IQ rates in Africa versus the higher rates in Europe. Gee, I wonder what you think would cause that. Well, it has nothing to do with skin color. There's other factors going into this. So a lot of online atheists use this type of reasoning they get from Gregory Paul or Graham Oppie, and it's just bad reasoning. And if you want to see a lot of like actual studies on how religion has been shown to correlate with lower crime, I'll see the video here, Is Christianity Harmful?, where we talk a lot about that. But continue on what you were saying now.
Yeah, so I mean, I've only seen Nyborg and Lynn in Oppie, and that's the most egregious citation I see there. I don't, by the way, think Oppie's aware of that. I'm not trying to accuse him of like laundering racist ideas here. I think that's the problem is he has a field, right? And he's really great at this field. But he presents this a bit normatively. And he says, look, if religion is like, is associated with these negative outcomes, like why would this, that's not what we would expect that to be secularization instead if we're all these kind of like maladjusted people with so-called daddy issues, right? And it's a really bizarre tack to take. And then he, I don't see, I've heard people try to say that's connected to his argument with Pataki, where he's saying, look, read this bad research and see how you feel. I don't see it. He presents it a bit more normatively in Atheism: The Basics. Now, Atheism: The Basics is a little bit better. He cites Elaine Howard Eklund's research, for example, which I think is good. I think is excellent, actually. But through most of it, I mean, he will. He presents Gregory Paul's research on religion and poor social health. I mean, the way Paul's research goes is so Paul is a autodidact kind of dinosaur illustrator, right? Like he works in paleontology, and he has this article where he says, look, nobody's really studied religion this way to see like this kind of complicated multivariate way that society. And so like, I'm going to do it. And then he doesn't do it the way that he says he's going to either, but he also throws away like literally hundreds of studies by that point, right? And he's like, kind of, I'm the first one. And so my main area of divergence with Oppie here was like, he ends that section with saying, look, this may or may not be true. Okay, I appreciate the humility on Oppie's part, but he goes, this is what the evidence tells us so far. But that's not the corpus of evidence, right? There's a lot of, I mean, I've got Shelf here, I've got Norris and Englehart's work, I've got Froze's work, right? There's a huge mountain of research looking at religion in kind of a cross-national perspective. And I certainly would not isolate, three, right, who are making a different kind of public point.
Yeah, it seems to be that there's so much more interesting data out there, like meta-analytical systematic reviews. And then they just cite like these simple bivariate comparisons of countrywide data. And like, as we demonstrate in these videos, there's a ton of data showing the exact opposite is true. So let's go into some of things you did. You've done a lot of work on immigration, for example. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit about this. Like you've actually published work on this. So talk a little bit about religiosity and immigration, like in Europe, for example.
Yeah, this is
So just real quick, I want to set up the question for the audience. So like a common argument from atheists online is that religious individuals are anti-immigration. They want to keep immigrants out of their country. And I see this on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, is that, if you want to really help immigrants, a secular society is the way to go. Religious people are anti-immigrants. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this line of research is really helpful in kind of walking people through what a scientific study to approaching the study of religion and society looks like. That generally speaking, sociologists of religion are not going to be looking at this to say religion good, religion bad. Let's lend ourselves to some like a philosophical argument here, right? And like I don't believe personally that like what I'm talking about lends itself to that debate, right? Like, does God exist or does God not exist or something like that? But it's more kind of a stepwise process, right? So like I was very curious about. I had done some research in the past on why citizens of Western liberal democracies were using their democratic privileges to vote for leaders with authoritarian characteristics in a few Western nations. I found I published a study where I showed that you could kind of disaggregate anti-immigrant sentiment as a really strong predictor of that. And I make the argument that they're voting for leaders with authoritarian characteristics so they could crack down on immigrants and use kind of the strong hand of the law. So then I asked, well, what's the religious factor in predicting anti-immigrant sentiment? And I go into the literature, and the state of the field is characterized as mixed. So I know there's a really popular study from the Pew Research Center. I think it's Being Christian in Western Europe. And they do find some kind of bivariate comparisons where, religious groups were in most countries, maybe even all, in their set of countries, right? They don't have all of them. Yeah, they had either slightly lower, in some cases, much lower support for admitting migrants. But then a few kind of peer-reviewed studies are come out, and some go in one direction and find like a secular advantage. Some go in another direction and find a religious advantage. So like, what's going on here, right? And so I had run a series of models. Right. And at first I find, kind of uniformly that like all religious groups, once you were controlling for things like race, class, gender, income, education, well, I guess it's its own class, but kind of standard demographic controls, which you need in quantitative sociological research, I had found that there was a pretty clear religious advantage across the board. Now, it changes though, right? Because I said, well, what if there's like national variation here? And so I won't bore people with the stats, but I ran some random intercept models, and I said, whoa, it actually really depends. Like when you account for like where people live, it seems like they're being conditioned to take either their secularity or their religiosity in different directions, right? And so like in some contexts, I was finding, pretty strong religious advantages in kind of being generous towards refugees. In another set, I was finding, well, actually, no, there are secular advantages, right? Like it depends on what national characteristics things interact with and how religious you are. So like in some cases, you have like nominal religious believers who were very nativist, anti-immigrant, but that would change as they became more religious. The only kind of uniform thing, so it very much depended, right? And that to this day, in the area of religion and attitudes toward refugees, it is characterized as mixed results. The only thing I found that was consistent is that members of religious minority groups, they tended to be the most generous of all, generally because when you're looking at Europe, religious minorities either were refugees themselves, their ancestors were recently refugees, or they're of the same ethnicities or religions that are arriving recently, right? So there's kind of there's a connection there. So it very much just depends on the context, and you will find like maybe 10 years apart, things will change too, right? Like who are the refugees? What are their religions? Where are they coming from? What is the national conversation that we're having now, right? You could have the same country have the results very much flip, right? Like, and if you're kind of older like me, you look at political parties in the United States and you can look back 10 years ago and be like, okay, well, this party's changed a lot, right? And that party's changed a lot too. And that might change, the religious groups that follow with them. So this is why I would stop short of looking at something like the Pew study. And I like Pew Research, I've worked with them too. And saying, well, look, it's 35% for Christians, but it's 55% for atheists who want to bring in, more immigrants, right? Well, there you have it. You have your whole story. It never really stops there. I think that's great demographic information for Pew to publish. I love Pew. I think it's sometimes used incorrectly in some of these online discussions.
Yeah, and I think that, you put that very well. It seems like when we get into the actual studies, like we talked about in Is Christianity Harmful, religion does not seem to be positively correlated with anti-immigration policies. Let's talk a little about prison populations. I
Yeah.
hear this almost every week, at least once, from an atheist. It says like, "Oh, atheists are underrepresented in prison." Wow, what isn't that odd? It seems like atheists commit far less crimes.
Mhm.
What is your opinion on this? Does it have any significance?
Okay. So yeah, I hear this a lot too. I think that, well, I mean, statistically that is true, right? And again, everybody is multidimensional, right? Like I am not just a religious person who doesn't commit crime regularly. And my neighbor over there is not just, or actually my coworker who we work on like religion and deviance and crime stuff together, who is an agnostic, right? She is not only an agnostic who doesn't commit crime. We are multidimensional, right? Like we're also either rich people or poor people, Hispanic like me, Chinese like her. There's a lot of male like me, female like her, right? There's a lot of things that are different about us. And so there's a really interesting story about atheists in the United States. Now, there is like discrimination against atheists here, right? Like I want to like practice our moral fruits, right? Like be aware of that and combat that. And this is where I think actually Zuckerman has done his best work in kind of combating anti-atheist stereotypes. But what's interesting is despite that, besides like being discriminated against for being atheists tend to be whiter, they tend to be wealthier. They're kind of tied with some religious minority groups in terms of like the highest levels of education. They're not the tip top, but they're up there for sure. And this is where you see a really common criminological study. Now, not to diverge too much, but I'm going to sidebar for a moment, right? Because I know what I'm going to say is really contentious, and I want to point out that there's good evidence here too. That in the United States, criminal justice system and racial minorities do not have the best relationship. And we have for decades and decades had really strong empirical evidence that, look, you get white man, black man, same crime, same socio-demographic background, go before a judge. The judge is going to kind of will on average rule harsher against somebody who is African American in this country. We see this. There was a great series of studies published based on a data set of 1 million traffic stops that found that white drivers were slightly more likely to have contraband, but were still less likely to be searched than black drivers, right? And so what's going on here? Well, one of the reasons, there's a lot going on here, but one of the first things that comes to mind is that prisons in the United States are overpopulated by...
It appears we lost him here for a second, so he'll jump back in a minute here. Looks like his device was disconnected. Fortunately, with the internet, we know that sometimes happens. Just so everyone who is watching, when Dr. Vaughan gets back in, we will do some Q&A with the live chat. So be sure to get your questions in. Here he's back right now. But yeah, as I was just saying, yeah, no worries, it happens. I've dropped out of my own streams, but I'm just saying, if anyone has a question for Dr. Vaughan, we're going to do some questions from the live chat at the end.
Sure.
So super chats will have priority. It will also help support this this channel grow in many ways. So please put in a super chat, helps us grow. For sure. But continue on with what you were saying with regards to the black and white crime issues.
Sure. So, I mean, and we've got evidence, right? We have really good evidence about like drug use, and there's like a 1-point difference between, white and black Americans in terms of drug use, but there's like a drastic overrepresentation of black drug users in prison, right? So like, I know some people disagree with this, but I think the evidence, by the way, the best data we have, it's all free, publicly available. Like somebody could like show the fraud and overturn our evidence tomorrow. I just want to like treat people who disagree with this with respect and let you know that the evidence is really rigorous here. And so what's going on here? Well, minority group members and also the poor, and there are different things about like why people in poverty commit more crime as well. But minority group members, people who are poor, just the marginalized in general, they tend to commit, they tend to not necessarily commit more crimes. They are imprisoned at higher rates than white Americans and also than wealthier Americans and more educated Americans, right? So like, for those that kind of understand how this works, then it's not surprising to see an overrepresentation of religious populations in our prisons because we are multifaceted people, right? And it's something like 1 in 3 black men, unfortunately, will go to prison, right? And they're also more likely to be religious. Atheists tend to be much whiter, educated, right? And this is all of these demographics. Everything about the profile, except for being overwhelmingly male, it corresponds with having better encounters with the law. Not trying to ignore the discrimination that does happen against atheists, like you have no morals and you're nihilist, right? That's ugly. It's nasty, and I don't deny that. But aside from that, they do select into some other demographic positions that make them less likely to commit crime. There's also, of course, like a relatively high rate of conversion within prison as well. And so Prison is a place, especially in the U.S., where you're confronted with your mortality a lot. It's dangerous places. I've had a cousin die in prison. It's an unsafe place, right? And people, this is the existential security thesis, which has a lot of really good evidence, right? People, it's the same reason that older populations tend to be more religious as well, right? Like the more you think about your coming death, the more likely you are to be religious, right? And also there may be some like kind of favoritism, good behavior things too, that very well might be happening. But again, prisons and crime, it's a complex place, right? It's not just people who have no other sociological characteristics about them besides either being religious or irreligious, criminals, non-criminals.
Right, and I like the way you put it. And you brought up something I wanted to point on. It's like that. Right now in the U.S., there are more minorities in prison, but being a member of a minority does not mean you're more likely to go to prison just because of your race. Like that would be a ridiculous assumption. So for some atheists online, like in the Twitter sphere, to say that, oh yeah, atheists are underrepresented in prison because atheists are less likely to go to prison, just ignores all these factors you mentioned, like people that convert in prison. There are numerous Christian ministries that go into prison to try to convert people. There are not a lot of atheist ministries going into prison trying to make more atheists. So that needs to be taken into consideration for sure. So again, if you have any questions in the live chat, put them in now. I'll super chats. I will save them and we will get to them for sure. But I do want to ask you another question. So does when you look at the overall view of religiosity, does sociological data indicate that Christian religiosity is beneficial for society, or no? What is your opinion on this subject?
Yeah, well, this is again why I feel like passionate about doing this, right? Because I think the public discourse gets a lot of this wrong. Now, I'm not aware of like one comprehensive measure of like all of the good life and all of the moral traits that somebody could have, right? If you've got that, I mean, like that's a Nobel Prize moment, right? What I would say is that there is good evidence of religion in general and also of Christianity. You were right earlier, and I've made this complaint myself, that there is too much focusing on the U.S. and Christianity in the U.S. Me and some other colleagues have tried to kind of go outside, and so I'm aware of both, right? Like I do think that, there are evidences of religiosity promoting good, right? So the psychological research kind of converges on religiosity being associated with improvements in mental health. And this is, I'm very much, I never use the word like consensus or status quo, but it's a majority review. Like the meta-analyses are very clear here. It's not predicted by the religion of the people doing the research, right? It's a very secular field that produces this. And we find that religion is a very powerful coping mechanism, both in general and also like in the face of adverse events. I'm working on with two irreligious colleagues on research on religion as a coping mechanism in the age of COVID. We've seen this in the terms of financial disasters, natural disasters, right? Like it's been a really great public resource for people in these settings. We see religiosity associating with higher rates of volunteerism, both the kind of congregational side and also the individual religiosity, including to non-religious and non-political causes as well. We see kind of the oldest sociological research going back to Tocqueville and Weber saw religion associated with social capital, which builds generalized trust, associated with electoral participation. It brings different kinds of people together, like especially if you have churches that are like in an area like New England, where they're further and farther between, where it's like different people from different races and types of neighborhoods are coming together to a kind of central square to kind of get to know each other. These are like some really kind of cool possibilities. We have research by Feng and Yang that shows religion as a resource for protests and authoritarian regimes. You've got work by Robert Thompson and others on Black church ecology. I was kind of going back to systemic racist problems in the U.S. and there's a lot of powerful research on the Black church tradition as kind of being a buffer against some of these problems. I mean, I could go on and on, right? And yes, there is what we call like dark side of religion research. I don't want to sweep that under the rug, but even the very language of that, right, shows us that this is a caveated thing, right? Like, yeah, sure, if you are involved in an aggressive cult or something, then that kind of religiosity is not going to be good for you. But there are, and there is research in that area, right? When I see religion associated with negative health or mental health outcomes, it's often in a case where either something like that, or it's very highly contextualized, right? I went this way, then that way, then things went wrong, and my life fell apart. Like, of course, right? Even if religion isn't causal, things are going to go badly for you, and that's really unfortunate. But in terms of like kind of the majority story here, there are a lot of areas where we're like, okay, at least over here and over here and over here, we see religion doing a public good. And there is some pretty good research that will also show us that, and non-religious populations participate and benefit well as well. Not as much as they should, not as much as I want them to, but there's something there. And so one thing I'll bring up with my students who are mostly non-religious, right? It's like what you do with it. And so I'm optimistic, somewhat consciously optimistic, right? Like I wouldn't just say plant a church and everything's gonna be fine. But like, there's a repertoire here. There's a repertoire of what religion can do for us in the public good, in terms of the public good. I don't want to lose it, and I think it could do more. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if you want to see a lot more of this research that we have talked about that he's just briefly covered, you could see a lot of these videos here. Final question, then we'll start going to the live chat so people get super chats in. It, of course, relates to this video that we recently put out. So one of the underpinning arguments of the meager moral fruits argument that atheists have used is that atheists often say that online they have bad experiences with Christians. Christians they interact with online don't really have good moral reputations they ought to have. Do you think this is a reliable indicator of religion, specifically Christian religiosity's effect on people? What do you make of these kind of testimonies?
No, I mean, I believe them, right? Like, I mean, my experiences online are very negative too. I mean, the most hopeful studies I can probably cite today would not be about religion, but would be to show you that, like, anytime we compare, like, the Twitterverse to public opinion, like, they could not be more different, right? And that's good. If you're online, you're like, this world is toxic. You go outside and touch some grass and meet people at the dog park, like.
Looks like he froze. He may come back here in a minute. Apologize for that, everybody. Appears we're having some technical difficulties. And anyone still hear me in the live chat, or are we both gone? Let me check on that because I'm not sure if it's both of us. No, it's just him. Okay, so he just froze there. So he'll be back here in a moment here. So we'll start going through the live chat again. Again, if you want to see some of the research that we put out, he has done a lot of the help with a lot of my videos as well. And he was just going and talking a little about the meager moral fruits argument. I do want to add my thoughts to this since he just stepped out. I will add him now. When it comes to social media and atheists saying that they encounter bad moral reputations with Christians online, it's important to remember something with this. Social media makes people toxic. We have seen this time and time again. And also, social media puts us into echo chambers. If you interact with something, you're going to see more of it, for sure. We tend to interact with things that emotionally upset us far more. So if I see an article attacking a Christian, I'm going to comment on it, like an angry comment on it or something, and I'll interact more with that. That'll tell the algorithm I want to see more of that stuff that made me angry or emotional. Likewise, atheists do it all. They interact more with comments of where Christians might be saying things that upset them. And so they end up seeing more of that. Social media puts us into echo chambers. So let me bring Dr. Vaughan back in and he can continue on with what he was saying.
Okay, welcome sorry. Back. I do think I fixed my network problem that made that happen. Don't mean to be
disruptive. Oh, no worries.
So, like, I mean, for one, like, harassment online is really bad, right? And I want to, like, affirm what people are saying they've gone through. I've gone through it too. I mean, I typically get it from white nationalists and I occasionally get it from online skeptics as well. And so, yeah, I've been threatened with death. I've had people message me weird stuff they shouldn't have known about me and my family. And it can be really scary, right? Like, so I'm not trying to say, like, no, research says that this isn't happening, so it's not happening to you, right? Like, that is bad. I would say it's not representative of any general population that I'm aware of. Like, we have no reason to suspect that. We have some evidence to the contrary. I don't think there's good evidence linking, religiosity with aggressiveness or anything that would predict that. And some good evidence to the contrary in the psychological literature, the social psychological literature. It is a real problem, right? Like, I don't want to ignore that, and I don't want people to ignore it when it happens to me either. But yeah, if anybody is, and I guess I should kind of be straightforward that, like, I don't follow the philosophical stuff very closely, right? So, like, if somebody, so don't take this as me like accusing anybody of anything. If somebody is kind of working, into an argument that religion is bad because of what I've seen online, I would say, no, that is not generalizable. And finding a generalizable sample is something that's really important in social science, right? Like, if I, get a sample, if I want to study, like, election attitudes in America, for example, and I recruit 1,000 Americans for a study, and I find out that 75% of my sample is Hispanic like me, well, that's not going to help me predict the next election, right? Because, like, that's not what the country looks like. That's not, America. People like me only don't make up that much of the country, right? It's not representative. Similarly, people who are engaged in these kind of conversations online, they're not representative of real life. They're not even representative of Twitter. Like, we find that like that is like 1% of like a 10% demographic within online spaces that is doing this sort of thing. So no, fortunately, I mean, this world would be a lot worse if everyone was like that. But maybe we could chill out a little bit, right? Like it still sucks. So I would encourage people to behave better. Me too, by the way. I'm not always nice, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just always find it interesting that atheists want to use their personal testimony as evidence against religion from people they've met online, and I'm like, social media puts people in echo chambers. Social
Sure.
media just makes people angry. This is not indicative of religion, and there's no data that indicates that. In fact, we presented studies in the videos on this channel that show that religiosity correlates with a decrease in aggression, a decrease in a lot of these negative qualities. So for them to use that as evidence, and people that you've interacted with, it just shows there's a lot of gaps that they're logical leaps they're making, and the data just does not support that.
Well, this is why sociology is so cool. I mean, kind of like day one in your average social class, you'll learn about the sociological imagination, right? And it's like one good way to start your research is to, yes, look at your experiences, right? Like they're not invaluable, but those are going to be your troubles, right? We call them troubles. And then you want to ask, okay, well, how does this relate to the public shared experience, right? Because it may be like me, but it may not be like me. So what's representative of where we go to and of what people go through? And we call those issues, right? That's and to connect these two to see where history meets society and biography. That's a sociological imagination, right? So I would encourage people, not to disregard it and say, well, if nobody else is experiencing it, doesn't matter. But yeah, I would not. We come to a lot of wrong conclusions that way, and I think it's one of the reasons why I love sociology so much, and I hope people will start reading in this area, right? Because it does help you kind of decenter yourself from how you explain the rest of the world, because we only experience things psychologically, which is really cool, but it's a challenge to experience things sociologically.
Yeah, and we're going to jump into the live chat here next.
Cool.
But just so people are aware, a good example of that would be this video, does Christianity cause Christian nationalism? Because a lot of people just assume Christian nationalism is a result of Christianity. But I mean, you provided some studies that you gave to me for this video that I put out, which shows it's actually the exact opposite. So this is why sociology is so important, because we can study these kinds of things and see if Christianity really does cause Christian nationalism. And the data doesn't show that kind of that at all. So going to the live chat now, let me hide this down here. Real quick, I'll put this one up. Thank you for the super chat. She sent this in earlier. Didn't want to interrupt. We do appreciate that. First question is from Nicholas Wheeler. Any books to recommend on this topic that we should look at?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so let me see what I got going on here. This is kind of dated, but I think in terms of the kind of whoops, my books are all falling now. In terms of just kind of the theoretical approach for understanding how we do this, I really like Putnam and Campbell's book, American Grace. So one book people may have heard of is Bowling Alone. It's one of the only social science books to kind of get a mainstream audience, and that was done by Robert Putnam. I believe he's at Princeton University, and he's the top social capital scholar in the world. He's on air, descending from the air of Tocqueville. It feels like that's a really great one. I don't know if you don't mind if I just kind of think about this live. I'm just kind of looking at my shelf here.
Yeah, while you think about it, I'll put out a book here. George Yancey's work is some interesting stuff. Just on he has done some research on Christianophobia in academia, which is some stuff that I have read, showing that it does seem that there is some sort of anti-Christian bias in academia, which may lead to people making these sort of assumptions that religion leads to harm. So he's got some pretty good work as well to look into.
Yeah, another really accessible one is Rodney Stark and Roger Finke's Acts of Faith. Now, the religious economies theory is kind of fallen out of report, but it's really accessible. It was published in 2000, and I would kind of avoid Stark's later work, but it was published in 2000. It goes over kind of the history of the sociology of religion. Oh, there's a great one actually. Okay, now the fire's burning. I would recommend what's the name of the book? I may have my Zotero. The name of the book is Courtney Bender's edited volume, Religion on the Edge, Decentering and Recentering the Sociology of Religion. I think that Grace Davies' Sociology of Religion book as well kind of helps us look at things from a new angle here. I think that, there's a lot, right? I'm looking at Julian Go and George Lawson's Global Historical Sociology. This isn't really so much about sociology of religion, but it speaks really well to my kind of desire to kind of see the U.S. decentered from like just the way we do social science, where I think a lot of these problems come from. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of like there's a ton of stuff in. I mean, I'm blanking now, and I'm gonna think of like all the better ones later on. But those are some of the early things that I read when I was first getting started, and I'm kind of struggling to think of things that aren't too technical. But that's a good place to start.
Okay.
General sociology. One thing would be it's an older one, but Alan Johnson's The Forest and the Trees is just kind of an easy read, kind of nice way to learn to think sociologically.
Excellent. So this question is: should we stay Protestant, or does it matter? I assume this is. Since this is a talk on sociology, I don't think this is a theology question.
Okay.
I think this is more of a talk on is Catholicism, does it have better results, or does Protestantism have better results? That's how I'm interpreting this question, because again, this is a talk on sociology. We're not trying to take a theological stance on that right now.
Sure. Gosh, I mean, so like one of the things I'll talk about with my students is like, you know, it's religion if and, or secularization if and, right? Like under certain conditions they can go in, you know, not so great directions, and under certain conditions they can go in really cool directions. And I think the comparative stuff with Protestants and Catholics, like they just, I don't know of a way to like kind of get a comprehensive scale to have them even out. I think that there's some kind of interesting work on you know, Protestants and what do you call it? Some liberal democratic outcomes. It's really interesting. I think
Robert Woodbury's work, yeah.
I think there's this cool stuff on Catholics and kind of like labor politics and immigration activism that I really, you know, appreciate. So like in the U.S., for example, we have 9 agencies, I think, that are responsible for resettling refugees here, and 7 of them are religious. Either all of them or most of them are Catholic, and so I think that's pretty cool. So just in terms of like me thinking about like who's producing to society, I mean, going back to Stark stuff, again, I know that religious economies theory is a little dated, but I do think that like a healthy, kind of free and robust religious sphere where Protestants and Catholics are active and in conversation together is really helpful. Just more stuff coming to mind, by the way, and that could speak to this topic, would be 2 books from Robert Wuthnow. An older one is called The Restructuring of American Religion, something like that. It's 88, but it tells a really great story of how we got to where we are, and much of it still applies today. He has a newer one. This is a guy, I think, at Princeton as well, called Why Religion is Good for American Democracy. And so he's clearly taking a point of view there, but it does kind of have a choose your own adventure format to it. And he'll talk about, hey, on this like key issue, right? On this war, on COVID, on peace activism or whatever it is, right? Here's where most evangelicals were. Here's where liberal Protestants were. Here's where Catholics were. And here's where the Black church was. And here's where Pentecostals were. And, you know, kind of, you could, I can see different people reading those chapters and being like, you're right. No, you're right. And so, you know, I would make a bad theologian, so I don't want to tell someone whether they should be Protestant or Catholic, but that would be kind of a fun work to kind of work through. And it's really accessible too, to kind of go through and see like, okay, at this key moment, at least in the US, here's where I would have been.
Yeah, and when I've looked at some of the data on Catholics and Protestants, they both have positive results, sometimes in different ways.
Yeah.
So you'll see a lot of good positive results from Catholicism on Medicare, immigration, and for Protestantism, it correlates more with like citizen empowerment, voice and accountability, promoting education. But you can see that also with both groups. It
Sure.
can be mixed, and so most studies I've seen tend to look more at like different terms used within sociology, like intrinsic or extrinsic religiosity, not necessarily dividing along denominational lines, but you do see that definitely at times.
The denominational thing is really important too. Just like the nature of Protestantism is to be denominational, and so like kind of like at key moments in history, they could like turn into fighting and stuff that was bad, but it also turned into like deliberation and was kind of a proto-democratic force, because like when we decided we don't want to fight, then we try to get along, and getting along is hard. So you do the heavy work to get along. And within Catholicism, again, not to throw the whole thing under the bus, because there's cool stuff there, but generally speaking, right? Like I don't think like the larger Roman Catholic Church spends a lot of time in the public sphere with like 17 Sedevacanists that might live there. Yeah.
So let's move on to another question here. Here's an interesting question. Have you seen any claims on the internet of religion merely being a coping mechanism?
So this is kind of interesting. I like this question a lot. Thank you, Superliminal Sword. It's an excellent sword. So we've got this idea of a coping mechanism, right? And sometimes you might hear it like put as a crutch as well. I guess that presupposes psychological utility, though, right? Like, it is something that we can tap into in times of hardship. And so this is, when I'm trying to teach these things in a kind of neutral fashion, right? It's one of the things I'll let my students know. It's like, okay, look, we're seeing that, and you got like good longitudinal research that's like sufficient for tapping into causation and stuff. And it's like, you have people that are doing fine. In comes a recession, in comes Katrina, in comes SARS or COVID, and then they turn to religion, and so they don't feel as bad, right? I guess when I see that, I don't see a bad thing that's happening there. Someone else, so I could look at that and say it's a resource, or if you don't, if you just don't like religion, you could look at that and say it's a crutch, right? So I guess the only area I would really kind of zero in on is merely. I don't think so. We'll have like statistics on variance explained, fit statistics and stuff, which basically tells us like between like what's going on with these people, how much does religion explain? On average, it's going to be 10%, 20% of the differences. And so I think religion can be a coping mechanism. And if you take that to mean crutch, very well. I don't think it's a bad thing when you can turn to something and it alleviates your depression and anxiety in a given situation. I think that to me sounds like a matter of spin. But it's not only that, right? Like, as I said, it's a resource for community. It's a place where we volunteer. It's a place where we learn. It's a place where we argue, hopefully in healthy ways, as now we'll talk about. It's a place where, and just look here, right? It's a place where we let immigrants sleep on the floor because they're in hiding, right? Like, there's some churches in San Antonio that were doing that when I was growing up that I really admired. There's a lot of things. So I'm mostly going to take issue with the word merely. And as a sociologist, I guess I can't tell you whether or not it's good that someone can turn to religion or your family or something else to make you feel better. And if you want to call that a crutch, very well. But I would take issue with the word merely.
Yeah, I think I remember reading a book by two neuroscientists called Why God Won't Go Away. And they basically, and as part of their argument was like, if religion was actually true, we would expect it to actually help people get better. And so the fact that it does help people, maybe, I'm not necessarily making this argument, it maybe could lend credence to the support that at least some spiritual world beyond our physical world is real. So I found that kind of just an interesting that just saying it is a coping mechanism kind of is, in some ways, the atheist might be shooting himself in the foot, because if it does that, that might be indicative that it actually is something more there.
Generally speaking, and now, again, as sociologists and social psychologists, we're not kind of making these value judgments as to whether God exists or there's a divine hand reaching out. But I don't see the coping mechanism is a good word in the literature usually.
Yeah. So here we just got another super chat. What percentage of religious people are intrinsic or extrinsic in religiosity? Is it mostly extrinsic or intrinsic? Now, this is something I've actually looked for, and I have not found. So I was curious what you would say on this.
Okay,
I've been trying to look more into this.
The simple answer is I don't know. I don't actually so I know this literature and I respect it and I think it's important. It doesn't really feature in what I do. And when I see religion kind of like benefiting society, I don't see so much of an intrinsic and extrinsic divide. Now, that's often in the kind of data I work with, that's kind of hard to measure. So it just doesn't come up, and I would use it if I could, but it usually doesn't come up. And unfortunately, Trackets, I'm sorry, I don't know that. I'd be curious what you might have found, Michael.
So it's difficult to really say. There's not been any like major polls or major studies indicating more of what the dividing population is. From what I have seen, though, is that Europe seems to have more extrinsic religiosity, which may contribute to the decline of it because people are finding more ways to have community outside of church. For those who don't know, we should probably define these terms. Intrinsic religiosity refers to being religious because you want to follow the core tenets of a religion. You're religious because you have faith in God and you want to be a part of that religion. Extrinsic religiosity refers to being a part of a religion for extrinsic means, like you're part of a social network, you're part of a community. That's why you're religious. And so what I have seen is that it seems that there was a lot of extrinsic religiosity in Europe. Like with state churches, people just sort of did it because that was the community they were part of. And that's contributing to a large portion of religion declining. Not all of it, but a large portion of it. Whereas in the US, especially in a lot of Bible Belt areas, the South, it's more part of their identity. Someone is a Christian because it is part of who they are, not just because it's part of their social network. But again, no large scale polls have been done. This is only things I found hints to in the literature.
Yeah,
But that's what I've seen. And that's what I've seen a lot. But yeah, when you do study the data on intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity, more of the positive benefits are tied to intrinsic religiosity. And
Yeah,
this is important because atheists sort of say, well, you can get all the good benefits of religion without religion. Just you can have a local community you're involved in. But that's not the issue. The actual benefits of religiosity are tied to the intrinsic aspects and intrinsic orientation. So you do need the core tenets of the faith. You do need belief in God, belief in the spiritual world. That is what is actually tied to the benefits. It's not just the extrinsic aspects you could have with an atheist community or with your local bowling club. You're just there to be part of a community. So that's something to keep in mind.
You'll get more from that for sure. I mean, I think like community generally is always going to be good. So like I think you can kind of get some of it, but then what we'll find is, meaning making is also something that is really important, right? So like you're not going to get meaning making as much from a bowling league as you will like a narrative, right?
Right.
So you get meaning making, you've got the power of theodicy. There was the research on like I just in the past week, this is on my mind. I've been reviewing for another study. We're doing like stuff on like religion and recessions, and it's like the idea of confidence in the divine plan, right? Like again, like I think it is good to be a part of your bowling league. That that's what Putnam talks about, right? Like he's worried that he's seeing people bowling alone more often. But I mean, unless you really, really like bowling, I don't think it's going to give you a sense of existential security. If it does, more power to you. But it's not been my experience.
This is not a question, but I just want to put this comment up. Extrinsic religiosity reminds me of how many politicians and political figures suddenly become Christian when they start gaining popularity or running for a position. Yeah, that's a good example of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is showing up in some of my work I'm doing on Hungary.
Oh yeah. It just becomes a cultural thing, and we see this with a lot of politicians, unfortunately. So I did have another question about China since you have done some work there. Cool. Someone asked. He says he does stuff in China and Christianity. Is it still growing fast? What is your comment on this?
Okay, this is a great question, and we can get into some nitty gritty here, which I like. So the kind of top scholar on religion in China is Vaughan Yang, and I would just kind of follow him, and then like anyone that's been produced from his excellent research group at Purdue University. He had a very popular statistic that he was citing. Now, I should say projections are really hard. So, and projections are often not true or do not come true because this is like we're saying in 50 years, this will happen. That's what I mean by a projection. And like, so we'll often see that Pew Research chart that says, all right, well, like nuns are going to shrink and Christians and Muslims are going to grow by 2050 and be like neck and neck. Maybe, but those are really hard. And so Professor Yang had a stat that China was going to be like 30% Christian by 2030. And that was very widely cited. I think it was well done at the time, but with the caveat that people don't understand that history could intervene. Right now, we have signs going in the opposite direction. So like I was a part of a panel at the Pew Research Center in 2018, and it was me, it was Jerry Park, Vaughan Yang, another guy, I forgot, he's a Buddhist kind of scholar, Nancy Emmerman was there, and it was a big debate. And what we've seen are signs going in opposite directions. So in survey research, the growth of Christianity in China has been really modest. It's been steady, but it's been much more modest than Yang was predicting. There's some experimental research that suggests that people are underreporting because of two things. One, there's kind of a cultural milieu where people will not consider themselves to be Christians until they've been baptized. It's kind of hard to organize a baptismal service. And two, because they're worried about tracking from the government. You have similar anomalies in U.S. Census data on who identifies as Native American or not, because at a certain point in history.
Can you spell that Chinese scholar really quick?
Is there a way I can type it, or I can just So his first name is Feng Gang. So
say that again. Feng.
Yeah, Feng Ang, and then his last name is Yang. I've also sent it to you in this.
The private thing.
Yeah. So you can put that on the screen too.
Yeah, I'll put that up for people right now. But go on, continue.
Oh, sure. And so we've seen kind of in public opinion data, very, very moderate growth over time. There we go. Yeah, right. But what's really interesting is that at this conference, they were pointing out that church growths, that there have been churches are kind of exploding in certain parts of the country that seem to outperform what's happening with the population, which is really curious. And then I know that Grace Davies and Chihuahua Wang, they had done some survey work where they had gone into just one city. So I don't want to extrapolate from this. And they found that like the rate of Christian belief was much higher than census data had revealed. And so the short answer is that we don't know. I do think it's still increasing. I'm not sure if it's the fastest increasing right now, that like maybe there is like a kind of brick wall that it hits. It's possible that Yang overestimated, or it's possible that history changed things. I mean, the religious policy under Xi Jinping is a lot different than Hu Jintao. I mean, I used to live in China, and I never thought I would miss Hu Jintao, and now I do. And so, yeah, I mean, so a lot of things can kind of get in the way too. And yeah, sometimes I know there were like kind of romantic stories in Christianity about like persecution, what is like the blood that grows the church or something like that, the seed of the church. And sometimes yes, but sometimes no. Sometimes it works, unfortunately. And yeah, it's hard to say. I think there's still some growth, but if I had to, and there's not a consensus opinion here. It's a hotly debated area. I would say there's some growth. I don't know if it's anywhere near as fast as we thought before.
Yeah. Just so we're going to be closing out soon. I just want to let everyone know in less than an hour, I will be on Dr. David Falk's channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible. We're going to talk about his recent debate he had with Titus Kennedy on the date of the Exodus. So in less than an hour, you can join us on that channel. I'll be on there for a little bit. We're going to just cover his debate and how Dr. Falk basically wiped the floor with him, if you want my opinion on it. And I know I'm biased towards Dr. Falk, but man, there was just a lot of issues Kennedy had in there. But yeah, I did want to bring that up just so people are aware that's going to be occurring. So we'll get one more question in here, and then we will close this out unless we get any more super chats in. So someone asked, do you have a YouTube channel? And I'm not sure if that's accurate or not.
What is the name of Dr. Vaughan's YouTube channel? I don't have I think I have like an old YouTube channel that I put a couple of classes from the pandemic on, and they're all private. I don't have one. I'm on social media at Ken Vaughan Soch. I guess I can chat that too. It's kind of a wild ride on there, just to let you know. I don't do this sort of stuff all the time, but I'm happy to talk to people on there and answer questions. Maybe one day when I have more time, I'll go to YouTube. I don't feel like I'm good at that. If I had a YouTube channel, my son would think I was cool though.
Well, what I would tell you to do at this point, but here's your Twitter link for anyone who wants to find you there, is to get on TikTok or do YouTube Shorts, because right now the new public square is becoming TikTok.
I'm very long-winded though, as your people probably know by now.
It will help you learn to get less long-winded, and you can get better at it. But yeah, there's a lot of misinformation being spread around TikTok, so I'm always trying to get more people on there who can correct that stuff. But yeah, you can follow Dr. Vaughan on Twitter, where I've seen him post some pretty great stuff on there. That's how I found him as well. But yeah, thanks for coming on, talking about this whole issue. Any final thoughts on the whole idea that a lot of anti-theists use to try to argue that religion is harmful and it'd be better if it goes away?
Read widely. It's tough work to study religion in society. There aren't a lot of simple answers. If you see somebody saying silver bullet or secularization silver bullet, put up your red flag. And I think, read more sociology. It's really good. I know that we have a bad rap, but it's a lot of it's empirical, a lot of it's fun, it's transformative, and not just in religion, right? Like read sociology of religion. If you're interested in politics, read political sociology. If you're read cultural, do whatever, right? Like read sociology. It's cool.
Right. And if anyone wants to see any videos that Dr. Vaughan has helped me with, 3 of them are up here, as well as another one I did. But yeah, check out some of these videos. We go into a lot of the data there and explain why Christianity doesn't lead to these types of things that it's constantly being accused of. But Dr. Vaughan, thanks for coming on the channel. Much appreciated. I've been wanting to do this for a while now, so I'm glad to finally have you on, and they can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Does religion lead to all these problems that it's constantly being accused of? No.
Right on. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, everyone, and I'll see you next time.